Welcome, everyone. This is a walking writers salon. We actually have a photographer and writer all in one body. Arturo Soto is our guest for this evening's salon. We're talking about his time in Oxford. He'll tell us a bit more about how or why he got there. And we're also going to be talking about his photo narrative book, which is called A Certain Logic of Expectations, the cover of which you can see behind me on my virtual screen. Those of you who are unaware of what salons are about, what we try to do with a walking writers salon is give a bit of a grilling to the author to find out about how they go about writing and their approach to walking narrative, and hopefully explore a little bit about who they are and what their work is. What I'd like to do is just quickly say to those who are unaware that it's all part of Walk, Listen, Create. We're not-for-profit supporting artists, performers, writers, pretty much anyone who makes work to be experienced on foot, or they make the work on foot. So what I'll go to now is I'm going to read out the bio that Arturo has provided on the Walk, Listen, Create website. So Arturo is a Mexican photographer and writer living in Los Angeles. He holds a PhD in fine art from the University of Oxford and graduate degrees from the School of Visual Arts and University College London. He curated the exhibition Foreign Correspondence at the Architectural Association and participated in the first edition of Forecast platform at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt. I hope I pronounced that right, no idea. His work has been exhibited internationally and is included in the books Imaginaria and the Subjective Atlas of Mexico. His critical writing has been published in Seven Insider, C4 Journal, and Photo Eye, among other places. So, Arturo, we're going to hand over to you because you're going to give us a little presentation to begin with.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm coming off from a cold, so I apologize for my voice. I hope it doesn't go in the middle of the presentation, but yeah, thank you for tuning in. I want to share different aspects about my book, A Certain Logic of Expectations, which is a subjective kind of interpretation of Oxford, or my experience of Oxford. What brought me there was the PhD that Andrew just mentioned. And so I lived there for 5 years. And, you know, when you do this kind of degree, you propose a project. So the project that I proposed was actually a different one. I was going to do a project about the border between Mexico and the US. And in making that project, my supervisor suggested that because I wasn't going to be photographing constantly for that project, given that the pictures were about the border, that I should, you know, take on something else that I could work on regularly, given that, you know, I was going to be in Oxford constantly. So most of my projects so far had been about photographing and depicting the places where I had lived. And so I decided to make a project about Oxford, which I had kind of started anyway, but in a way, most of my time while in Oxford was working on this project. And so I have to say, I was fascinated by Oxford the moment that I set foot in it. I loved it. I still love it. It's very close to my heart. It's a fascinating city, very different from all the other places where I've lived. I was born in the border, but I'm from Mexico City. And then I lived in Savannah, Georgia, and in New York, and in Panama. So Oxford was nothing like those places. I also lived for a year in London. And the ways in which it was different, that's what I was trying to capture. But then, you know, I quickly realized that many other people had been equally interested in Oxford, except that most of those accounts were quite similar. And so if you've been to Oxford, or if you've heard even about Oxford, you probably equated with its university. And that, I think, tends to be a mistake, because the city and the university are not the same thing. And the city itself is really interesting. And so just focusing on the university kind of like doesn't do the city justice. That's one thing. The second thing is that even if you just focus on the university, people tend to just foreground the same things over and over and over again. And so because the university is so important and has such a prominent place in the, you know, in the British imaginary, there's an industry around it to promote tourism. And so all of these books that have to do with the university, at least the more visual ones, there's obviously like very serious history books about the institution, but at least the more visual ones tend to just capture the same things over and over and over again, and they're heavily focused on architecture and the old buildings. And so that creates a kind of mythology that gets perpetuated, you know, endlessly. And so my challenge was just to stay away from that, find a different angle. There are obviously experts that have written about the history of the university and the history of Oxford. So this is not meant to be a comprehensive historical account by any means. It has a few, you know, facts that I found interesting, because I also wanted it to be a book that people encountered as an art project. And so that's something that, you know, we shouldn't lose sight of. It's an art project, it's not a history book. And it's also, it's within the tradition of documentary photography, but it's not, you know, a photo book that is trying to advocate for a certain cause or anything. I am very interested in the sociopolitical aspects of images, and so therefore the images reflect that. But I didn't want it to be also very didactic, you know. I didn't want it to be about one thing. If anything, I wanted to encompass a feeling, and my challenge was to make it hopefully interesting to people that haven't even been to Oxford. And so I'm going to show you a few pictures here. Well, first of all, again, I'm just going to show you the book so you see the size of it, because that's important. It's meant to be kind of like a book that is not too big, so that people really engage with it and read the texts. Texts can be present in not only in photo books, but in art in general in different ways. And sometimes they can be there not necessarily to be read. You know, sometimes text is meant to play a more visual role, a more perceptual role. In this case, I wanted people to read the text. But the dynamic of the book is that the text and the photographs don't relate like one-to-one, you know, so they're not captions to the photographs. They're there as their own narrative, and so the photographs and the text kind of like flow parallel to each other, without explaining each other, or without reducing one to the other. I would walk regularly in order to make these pictures, which means that I would set out walking to see what I would find. And you know, I did make certain photographs that were, let's say, cliche, but that's usually a normal process in the act of photographing. I feel like it's good to get those pictures out of your system. You have them there, you don't have to use them. Photography is as much about editing as about making the photograph. So once I started to define the kinds of pictures that I was interested in, I really tried having those pictures say something about the time that I was living in. And so Brexit was happening, I'm a foreigner. Part of the point of the pictures is also that they have my own perspective, and that means the perspective of a foreigner. And the British have been really good at passing judgment, documenting, whatever you want to call it, depicting other places. But I found that they weren't so keen in having a foreigner depict their own city, And so that was interesting to me. And obviously, also a lot of Brexit had to do with foreigners. And so these things were on my mind as I was photographing, which means that the photographs are not necessarily illustrations of this, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that they're not there. And the beautiful thing about images is that they can be ambiguous. Words can be literal, but images often are best when they're ambiguous. So I'm going to explain some aspects, but that doesn't mean that, if you went through the book, it would be as obvious. But again, that doesn't mean that it's not there. So here, for instance, you have kind of like a path that goes into different directions, which for me was a little bit like what was happening in British society. You could have taken this path or the other path, and then the sign, the graffitied sign says LOL, just, laughing out loud. And I found that a little bit appropriate in the sense that the choices were, to me, so obvious, like obviously Britain should have remained in the European Union, and yet I constantly encounter people that I thought were really smart, and obviously also this was happening at the same time that the first Trump election was happening, right? So there were constantly people saying like, oh, well, just to play devil's advocate and things like that. And I was like, I don't think the devil needs an advocate for some of these things. You just need to do the right thing. And so contemplating some of these political options to me seemed like a no-brainer. And yet, it was a big shock when the Brexit vote turned out to go in the direction that I thought was not the good one for the country. And again, I'm not even British, and I still felt it. Some of these pictures try to do different things. The beauty of the urban landscape can sometimes be evasive, let's say, if you stay away from the obvious subjects. So a picture like this for me shows a really beautiful British street that some people might not even consider it because it looks kind of ordinary if you compare it with the super picturesque streets of the center. And here you even have one of the buildings of the university, which is St. Stephen's House. And so as I was making more and more photographs, I eventually wanted to kind of create a system for myself that defined the project, because at some point I was like finding my ground in terms of what I should include or exclude. And so at some point I thought I would include people. At some point I thought that I would photograph interiors, and I discarded those, and I decided to mostly concentrate on the areas outside of the city center. And so the rectangular photographs are pictures outside of the city center. But in the end, I thought that it would be good to have some of the university present in the book. And so with a different camera, I'll explain that in a second, I photographed buildings that belong to the university, but just in ways that I thought weren't very complementary, trying to stay away from these visual cliches of what is expected when depicting the university. And so this is one of the university's most famous buildings, the Bodleian Library, except that I photographed it when it was being worked on, kind of like, kind of like when you try to capture, let's say, in a portrait, an off moment of the subject, and it's trying to reveal something, especially, let's say, if you're photographing someone really beautiful, and by not photographing them at their best, you're trying to say something that goes beyond what is expected of the countenance of that person. So it's a little bit like that. Um, and again, I was trying to incorporate different sociopolitical aspects that I encounter, and that anyone that lives in Oxford will encounter, such as the social inequalities, which is very, where it can be very shocking if you're a foreigner and you expect coming to Britain, and you think that you're going to be in a much more egalitarian society, and even more so in a city that is so rich, and where an institution has so much money and power. And so there's this sign on public housing that says, "Stop killing the sick, poor, disabled, and homeless." Um, I was also trying to photograph as many different places of the city as possible, but then I caught myself falling into another kind of cliche, which is the typology. Perhaps you're familiar with the work of the Beckers, which they photograph like water towers and a lot of industrial structures, and they made grids. And for that kind of work, and a typological work, the system becomes more important in the end than the picture. All the pictures have to reinforce what the system or the methodology is trying to say. And so I didn't want to do that. So I strive to make pictures in as many areas as possible. But in the end, the selection of pictures had more to do with what the pictures themselves individually were saying, and also their aesthetics. I also wanted to include what I thought were interesting pictures, and not necessarily have like a very systematic, what do you call it, like way of like dividing all of these neighborhoods or districts within Oxford. The content of the pictures again was more important. And what I think I can bring to the table for the representation of such an important city is, again, my own subjective experience. And because I've had the privilege of living in different cities, I think I can bring a comparative eye to Oxford. So there are structures that, like this one, that reminded me of other places. This is a kind of store that, at least in Oxford, is not very common. It might be common in other places in the UK, but not there. And it reminded me of stores that I saw very often in Georgia. And so, someone might say, well, why is this so special? It's not special. That's the point. It's actually very ordinary, and yet not that common in a place like Oxford. This, for instance, is trying to show places that, and this is I'm saying this because this is a comment that I've gotten from many British people, that are not very interesting to them, but they're very interesting to me, because this is not the kind of housing that is very common in other places. So it might be commonplace there, but again, this shows a kind of urban environment that I think of as very particular of the UK, and that constitutes a lot of the city of Oxford, and not just, again, the city center. So it's also meant to be seen in relation to all of these buildings that are so iconic. Some of the pictures are meant to be more symbolic, again, like the first one. So I took this picture of these two deflated balloons because it reminded me of, or it alluded to the state of Great Britain at that point, a great empire that still wanted to see itself as as super powerful, and yet, many commentaries from the left, at least, which is what I was reading, were talking about how, to a certain extent, it's a delusion, and it's a problem because the politically, the many people on the right are not understanding the current place of Britain in the current geopolitics of the world. When the book came out, someone from Oxford bought it and wrote to me saying that they were glad to see this picture because it's close to where they live and it's something that they see every day. It's again a small scene, a quirky scene, but you can see that it says something about the uses of spaces and the uses of buildings, and how buildings constantly evolve and are patched up and changed uses, and so therefore sometimes aesthetics were important when they were built, but they take a backseat when it comes to making them functional. And some of these older buildings, as utilitarian as they are actually quite beautiful to my eyes because of the bricks and everything. And so I found it interesting because of the uses of space. But this person that wrote to me found it interesting because it's a site for him that it's very ordinary and routine. And so what I'm trying to get at with this is that I am very interested in how architecture and the urban environment makes us feel, which is really hard to capture. And usually that's when we either resort to iconic buildings or we have those feelings for places that we are familiar with. But if you think of when you travel, you have feelings for places. The environment is making you feel things, even if you're not familiar with them. And so how to capture that is very difficult with photography. And so that's why I wanted to bring in the texts, because the texts are what's going to be the gateway to dealing more directly with feelings and with kind of things that are extra visual, and that again are very difficult to capture with just a photograph. That doesn't mean that the photograph itself doesn't have the capacity. It has, like in the case of that person for whom this picture, that other picture meant something, but I also understand that it's not going to mean the same thing for everyone. And so how to bring out this capacity or this dimension, this affective dimension of images? Well, for me, the easiest way is through texts. Oxford has an interesting history that again goes beyond the university, like the fact that they manufacture the Mini there, and the history of the making of these automobiles is intrinsically related to the history of the city, because at some point they expanded the city in order to build housing for the extra workers that the factory needed. And so not a lot of people, for instance, know, especially outside of the UK, that the Mini is so entangled with Oxford. And so again, this is a history that has very little to do with like the Dreaming Spires of the university, and yet is very important to it. So what I found interesting here is just the promise also of the good life, what is the good life in Britain? Well, it's your own house, a little bit like the American life. It's your own house with some space for gardening, and an iconic car. I think I'm going to answer one of your questions, Andrew, that you were planning on asking. I'm going to answer it in advance, which is like, what did I find interesting about Oxford beyond the university? Well, the diversity of independent shops in Cowley, I think it's great. It's a very lively city. A great writer named James Hadley has published a book called Isolarian, which is just about the liveliness and diversity of Cowley Road and all of that area. So this is in Cowley, and that's where one of the where buildings of my faculty was. So I had to go there constantly. So going through that street is something that made me very happy. Except that not every faculty is on that street, obviously. So there's people that never go there. Sorry. I experienced this when I lived in New York. I lived in Astoria, in Queens, and I lived in a building where my landlord was living below me, and they weren't very friendly, so I didn't talk to them that often. But when I did talk, I once mentioned that I was going to Manhattan, which is where I was studying at the time, and they looked at me like like going to Manhattan was for them 5 times a year experience. They didn't like there, and just across the river was for them like a world away, and that didn't make sense to me. But it made even less sense to me the people that for whom going to Cowley, which is really close, it's like depending on where you live in Oxford, it's like a 15-minute walk, a 30-minute walk, whatever, a short bus ride. A lot of people didn't go there because even worse, a lot of people thought that it was dangerous. And this idea of like, just because you see, let's say something like this, advertisement coming down, sometimes people equate some of those things to like the city being run down or the city being dangerous. And, I come from Mexico City, so like those things are really far away from danger to me. And so what I'm trying to get at here is like, these are perceptions that people have, right? And these perceptions again come with feelings. And so I was trying to capture some of what those feelings might be in these different areas. You have here a store that is owned probably by someone with a Middle Eastern background. And all of those things bring diversity to a city and make it richer. And yet some people, unfortunately, equate that with danger or crime or the city being run down. And, I always found that really disappointing that some people might not take the 5, 10, 15, 20-minute walk that it took to get to Cowley. But again, I didn't want to stay away entirely from like what an aesthetic picture might be, except that I wanted to again load it with meaning, although I fully understand that meaning is not readable by everyone. So this picture is in a very picturesque street in the city center, in a building owned by one of the colleges, and usually fellows live there. So someone decorated this very nicely, and I made a picture, and you can see kind of like William Morris, which is associated with Oxford, a William Morris type of pattern here on the curtains. So even that relates to Oxford. But I took it because it was in a building that belonged to the university, so this is what the square ones are. But also because I thought it was interesting, an interesting arrangement that someone had put out in their window. Except that it turns out that, and this is not in the book, this is extra, but it turns out that I knew the person who lived there without knowing that they lived there. And these what do you call this? These glass jars and whatever, she had found on the back of St. Catherine's College, which was my college. So there's a big lot. There's some grass there, and apparently some people go there trying to dig things to see if they can find like valuable things. And some people find like bits of like some old coins or whatever, not necessarily from like Roman times, but still old. And she had found all of these there. So I found it interesting because it relates to my college. These turn out to have a much more interesting life. They were dug out from that lot behind St. Catherine's, and I ended up knowing that person. So that also just goes on to say how small the city is. I wanted to also to capture a few places that perhaps look like Oxford was a much more a bigger metropolitan area, which overall it is. And so places that really look like they could have been taken in London or at least a bigger city. And then another aspect of it was like, again, the myth of Oxford. How do you try to depict that? When I lived in Savannah, Georgia, I got an experience of this. It's bigger than Oxford, but it's still small. But it became really popular in the 90s because of a novel that was written about it called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And that really made people really flock to Savannah to check it out and experience the Southern Gothic that not, well, it's not a novel, it's more like a nonfiction book, had captured. And so the super pared down representation of Oxford is kind of here, kind of like bringing in together a few of its most iconic building, kind of like all meshed into one in the simplest of ways. And that's what I feel some people get when they visit Oxford for like an afternoon. And there's nothing wrong with visiting Oxford for an afternoon. I'm not criticizing them, but I am saying that that's what you get. You get a kind of a cartoony version of the city that is actually much more interesting. You're basically getting this, which is like a very abstract, pared down version of a city. So I'm now going to read a few texts quickly. Again, my PhD in general and the point of this project was the intersection between text and image, and so that's why this is how the book opens. It reads, "Images come with a promise, words with a compromise. The rewards of both lie in the affinities they create, as long as we distinguish reality from reality, as my friend Matthias once said while having beers on the lawn of St. Catherine's College, Cats. I always make an effort to check out the books in Oxfam's shop windows in St. Giles, even if I'm a bit drunk after a night out in Jericho. Some, like combinatorial mathematics for recreation, are clearly not intended for me, but I like imagining how they will make someone happy one day. Others I like because of their quirky titles, like Children and Hallucinogens, The Future of Discipline. A few make me sad because I know I will never get around to reading them. Determining which books you will manage to read before you die is likely to produce anxiety, but not knowing the exact number is a blessing." I should say, in terms of the walking aspect of it, I often walked with a camera most of the times to make the pictures, but often I would also just walk to think, to see what I could encounter. So there's kind of like different kinds of walking. There's the walking to make the pictures, and obviously often during those kinds of walks I would also just see things and encounter things, but I wasn't always photographing. If I went out photographing, I usually had to go, let's say, between 12 to 3, especially when it's still overcast and during the winter, because I shot on film and I was using a very low ISO, a not very sensitive film. So I was shooting with an ISO of 100, and therefore by 3 p.m. there was not enough light to photograph, which could be frustrating. And I didn't want to carry a tripod. That was one of my kind of rules. I came up with a few rules for myself, but not amounting to the kind of typology and system that I mentioned. And so, again, once I realized that I wasn't going to photograph people and that I was only going to photograph exteriors, that obviously led to more walking, right? But walking for like, I don't know, 3 hours with a tripod is not a great experience. And so if I didn't want to use a tripod, these are all kind of like related. If I didn't want to use a tripod, then I had to photograph when there was still enough light. And so therefore it had to be again around, 10 to 2, 12 to 3, sometimes around those times. So many things escape the grasp of photography. I hear a live rendition of Lágrimas Negras while walking on Old Marston Road on a summer day. It is hard to tell where the music is coming from, as the bittersweet bolero takes hold of the entire neighborhood. I am not a huge fan of Latin American music, but hearing this classic so far from home feels special, as it reminds me of the times my father would wake us up on Sunday mornings to the tune of Compay Segundo's version. So again, I'm trying to capture some things that are beyond the visual, like in this case, hearing music that seems to be coming from all directions. On Sundays, when my life is particularly dull, I force myself to leave my room. With the center mostly empty, I wonder how many times I have walked the same streets and looked at the same buildings. I usually end up at the Tesco on Modlin Street and buy a ridiculous combination of items I do not need, like chocolate, olives, and mustard, or something like that. Any routine that goes on long enough will harbor a level of frustration similar to Groundhog Day. However, as the film also shows, routines prime you to pay attention to ordinary details. A journal in the shop window with the legend, "Start where you are," on its cover is a perfect maxim for projects that blend photography with psychogeography. Instead of wishing to document faraway lands, photographers should consider examining their immediate surroundings first. Walking at dusk on Brasenose Lane, I see the Cotrington Library lit up, which is unusual. I think I am alone, but then someone behind me starts whistling a lullaby, which reminds me of Peter Lorre in the film M. Later, as I cross Modlin Bridge, I see a group of kayakers in the Cherwell. They are whistling a campfire melody that feels like a continuation of the one I just heard. The late geographer Doreen Massey once wrote that she felt like a space invader during her undergraduate years at Oxford. Inspiring experiences like beholding the Radcliffe camera at night also made her feel angry and alienated at what it stood for. Massey points out that while the political establishment has pitted migrants and working class Britons against each other, they have more in common than they think. Their self-imposed feeling of exclusion should become a joint effort to stake a claim at these institutions. I picked out some of these because walking is actually mentioned in the little paragraph. I should, perhaps you've already noticed this, but just in case it's not obvious. So the pictures don't follow a very linear narrative, nor do the stories. Each one is kind of like a standalone reflection, story, bit of experience that I had in Oxford. A lot of them, again, I wanted them to be about my subjective experience because that's what I think I could bring to the table. Again, not necessarily being super comprehensive, but just really state what I was feeling or seeing. Sometimes I hear laughter and celebrations when walking at night through the center. I can only imagine what goes on behind these walls. While I am a member of the university, I only have full access to my college. It is understandable that those who live here but do not have access to any of these buildings feel alienated from such a significant part of their city. One of my colleagues, who has lived in many places around the world, tells me this is the only instance when she and her partner have experienced the same city in drastically different ways because he was not affiliated with the university. On Sunday nights, Oxford is quiet in a way that bigger cities can only aspire to. A feeling of freedom accompanies the emptiness of the streets, but the sense of possibility never materializes since everything has long closed, and the only thing to do is enjoy the walk home in silence. Sorry. I see a man walking on New College Lane, pressing his hand against the stone wall, feeding on the energy of the material. He panics when a small chunk comes off and then struggles to put it back into place, as if that little fragment, which has probably been slack for a while, held the entire structure together. He moves on, but looks slightly taken aback, perhaps taking his failure to restore the stone as a betrayal of the building's history. Crossing Cornmarket Street after a night out, I hear someone playing Wonderwall on the harmonica. Nearby, a girl asks to be pushed into a high pile of trash bags, releasing a contagious smile when she lands. As I reach Radcliffe Square, I catch a pair of spotlights dancing atop the tower at Brasenose to the buffer beats of their biennial ball-themed Electric Dreams. The lights spill over to the camera's cupola, creating a magnificent spectacle for those who did not attend the party. As my studies come to an end and I face the prospect of returning permanently to Mexico, I relish the freedoms I have come to take for granted. Here, I can walk safely home after finishing the midnight shift at the Cats Library, when the rustling leaves on Iffley Road are my sole companions. The political reality of my country is so grim that it is hard to predict when we will have the same kind of civil liberties I enjoy here. What distinguishes a practical action from a symbolic one? I catch sight of a guy walking confidently towards the porch of the examination schools. It is a weekend, so the building is closed. His disheveled outfit makes it hard to tell if he's a hipster or a tramp. I am sure that many people have relieved themselves there since 1882, but few with the confidence to do it in broad daylight. And this is a text that closes the book. An inscription cleverly placed on the ledge of a garden wall in St. Clement's reads, "We walked everywhere, we discovered places." It is impossible not to get sucked into a dreamy narrative once you have spotted it. Oxford is so small, it is easy to feel you have seen it all after exploring the center. But the wealth of histories embedded in the prominent places, as much as in the hidden corners, guarantees that there will always be room for surprises. For me, that one was interesting because, I got to talk to a lot of different people while there, which is one of the great privileges of my life, in the sense that Oxford really facilitates different kinds of people coming together. And by that, I mean, people from different classes, different countries, different interests, studying different things. But many didn't really care about Oxford. And a lot of them really made a lot of assumptions about it, both foreign and national. And one thing that came up constantly was how, they knew it. And for me, that was hard to understand, especially coming from, like, let's say, people that were there for only a year, or even undergraduates that were there for 3 years. They thought that they knew it. I was like, there's so many things to know. And sure, you can feel a little bit like, frustrated sometimes if all the restaurants have closed by 9 on a Sunday. Yes, that wouldn't happen on a bigger city. But on the other hand, there were so many histories to know and so many interesting places where important events had taken place that I always felt a little bit disappointed when people really didn't consider some of the intricacies, let's say, of a place like Oxford. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Wow. Well, I mean, that was impressive talk through. Thank you very much. That was really brilliant.
Thank you.
I'm sure there are people who have questions to ask. I'll just start by saying, how's your writing and photography changed since you lived in Oxford? Because you left Oxford, what, 3 or 4 years ago or longer?
Longer, on 2020.
And
Yeah, that's a great question. I made this project and the other one that I worked on there about the border because I didn't want to keep on making the same kinds of pictures forever. I had basically done several pictures where I was doing this minus the writing, and then I wanted to change it up. So this came as a result of like trying to make these books different and a little bit more complex, include by the inclusion of writing. And now I am a little bit like that. Like I just finished a book about Mexico City that it's a similar exploration, except that just of one neighborhood rather than the whole city, the neighborhood where I grew up in Mexico City, and it will include some writing. The writing is different in that it's longer. These are paragraphs basically. These ones are like slightly longer essays. That's how it's different. Uh, but but now that I'm here in LA, I don't want to repeat the same project again. So to be honest, I am on the lookout for projects at the moment, just because I'm still very interested in the urban landscape. But again, I don't want to just repeat myself by doing the same project again and again. Um, in terms of just the writing, I am writing a book about urban landscapes, kind of like a primer, the kind of book that I would have liked, to have read when I was an undergraduate, that was kind of like an introduction to the genre of the photographic urban landscape. So, but that doesn't have my own pictures. That's more like an art history book, if you want to call it something. That's mostly what I'm working on nowadays.
okay, now, has anyone else got a question to ask? I mean, there are not many of us, so, just unmute yourself and shout out. Go for it, Data. Please do. You haven't
Yeah.
said who you were
Hi,
either.
everybody, and Arturo, thanks. I really enjoyed this. I grew up in the UK, but I have a German name and a German family, so I know about both sides of the story and the terrible racism that you can still experience. Um, and at the same time, I absolutely loved, seeing these images of yeah, so modest housing, um, and giving that value and these other takes that you had. Um, and I guess the question I'm sitting with is these kinds of things you can also, of course, find in other English cities. And I fully understand that your project is focused on Oxford, and I'm an anthropologist, so I'm so curious to hear more about what people said about your book, and especially like, you mentioned the shop with which looked like things you'd seen in Georgia. Like, did you go and find out about that, who owns it, and whether they come from Georgia and whether they built it in that way because of that, or, something like it? I don't know. And maybe a bigger question that I found myself asking, and also in relation to the last thing you said with, wanting to do a different project now. If you take these images and you can find them in London, you can find them in, I don't know, Brighton and Hull and Lincoln and York and whatever. And like, how and what is it I even want to ask? I'm just sitting with this, like, what is unique and what is general, and what is it that our feet tell us when we walk through these environments? Maybe that's my question. Yeah. Thank you.
It's a great question, and I struggled with it when I was making the work, because it was a question that, because I was making this work in an academic institutional environment, so I got feedback from my peers that were also doing their own PhDs, and also from my supervisors, and so it was actually, that was a privilege to be able to talk about these things, with other people. But it was something that came up constantly, and it was interesting hearing different aspects about this, whether the people obviously were from the UK or weren't from the UK. One way to answer this, it's not a perfect way because I don't think there's a perfect answer, but I taught for almost 2 years in Aberystwyth in Wales, and it's a very small city. It's even smaller than Oxford, and so it's also, you know, if you want to think about Oxford as a very niche city, which it is, Aberystwyth is also a very niche city, and so I was thinking, well, this is yet a small niche city, and yet it's so different from Oxford, you know. So a lot of the things that for some of the British people seem so obvious and so general, I wasn't seeing in Aberystwyth. Some of the housing is similar, but not all of the housing is similar. You know, the what's the word? How how big some of this social housing was in Oxford, for instance, was much bigger than in Aberystwyth. That creates, I'm not an urbanist by any means, but I'm interested in paying attention to these things. So that creates a different kind of street, a different kind of landscape, different kinds of social problems that were, for instance, reported in the newspaper in Oxford, which I like reading just to see what the perceptions of the city were by the city itself. I also read the paper in Aberystwyth, and so those things change. The plates, or whatever you want to call them, with the street names are different. You know, that can be quite shocking when you're in Wales and in some places, or I think perhaps in the whole country, the whole street name is in Welsh and in English. So, you know, so those things kind of change the urban landscape. They have an effect on how we perceive a street, and then you can go from like this the smaller aspect to the more general one. They change how you perceive a street, you know, a neighborhood, a city, perhaps even a bigger area. So the quality of the bricks, for instance, is something that comes up in some historical accounts of Oxford. The quality of bricks in general in the UK at a certain point was really high. You know, like they made really good bricks. That's something that I had never thought about in my life before moving to the UK. You know, for me, bricks were bricks. And no, it turns out that there's like high quality bricks, obviously still. And at some point, Oxford had a lot of those bricks. And so a college like Keble, which was built in the 19th century during the so-called Oxford movement that had a lot to do with the expansion of Anglicanism, was built with a certain kind of ideal in mind. And so that at that point, that meant building a college that was much more progressive and aesthetically very different from all of these other buildings that had used a particular stone from nearby quarries. And so they decided to do it with bricks, right? And so it was a shock to the system in Oxford because everybody hated Keble when it was inaugurated. And you see it now, and at least to my eyes, it looks incredibly beautiful, you know, but it's made of bricks. So those are 19th century bricks. It is also true that those bricks aren't everywhere. Now things have changed and now they look cheaper. And so you see other cities, which at that point I hadn't traveled that much in the UK. That was one of I didn't have a lot of money when I was studying there. So I couldn't leave Oxford that much, which also meant that my entertainment was going around and walking in the city. But now that I've been to more places, like, you know, there's definitely aspects like that might be small, but that do make it different than other places. And yet what you say is also true. To someone that has grown up in the UK, many of the things that catch my eye will be fairly general. So I think both things are true. But that's when you know, all of these are like very idiosyncratic visions. They represent a person's sensibility in the end.
Andrew, can I just respond?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So thank you. And I love what you say about the bricks. I now live in Catalonia in Spain, and I marvel at the fact that it is possible to build whole complexes of flats and houses, and you always know what your neighbors are doing like 3 flats down, because the walls, they're made of some kind of stone indeed. But I've often marveled at these bricks that I know from my childhood and that somehow were more soundproof. So yeah, and also the other thing I'd love to say is that I really enjoyed being taken back to um, the pandemic
Hmm.
and Brexit, and just yeah. But I'll stop there and leave space for other people to ask questions. So thank you and good luck with all your next projects.
Thank you very much.
Has anyone else got a question to ask? We're right on the hour, so I'm aware that we usually wrap it up pretty much after 1 hour. But if anyone else has a question they'd like to ask,
I do.
yeah, Baba,
That was very nice, Arturo.
Thank you very much.
Now I'll let Sylvie go first.
Okay, thank you. That's very nice of you. Well, sorry for being late. We couldn't attend sooner. This is Lionel and I'm Sylvie. And we work in Mexico quite often. I would just love to please tell me what you feel when you arrive when you go through the border from San Diego and you arrive in Tijuana, especially Playas, walking border there. How do you feel?
Well, you're probably going to be disappointed. I've never been to Tijuana. I was born in the other border between Juarez and El Paso. So I've been through that border countless times
what
in
do
my
you
life.
feel when you come from El Paso going to Juarez?
Well, I can talk about that for like 7 hours straight. It's always
just a brief, because it's it's something we work on borders.
Yeah,
especially
it's always. Tell me.
No. I listen to you. Go ahead.
It's always interesting to see how much changes just from crossing a small bridge, and the kind of planning that has gone on in El Paso, and often the lack of planning that you see in a place like Juarez. But one aspect is obviously what you perceive visually in terms of the urban landscape, but another thing is the kind of community that people have built there that is transnational, and that I always like saying that as well, because they are less divided than people think. They are very divided in terms of the government and in terms of how they look, but many people live in one place and work in the other place. There's a lot of legal migration, in the hundreds of thousands that go every single day from one place to the other. So that flow is also something that I think about, and that I just published another book this year. It's called Border Documents, and it's telling my father's memories of growing up there. And so if you're interested in that, you might find that book interesting, because it's literally about this kind of flux, that happens when you grow up on the border between Mexico and the US.
Eres chihuahuense entonces.
Sí, soy de Chihuahua.
It took you some time to what's she saying? Yeah. Okay, I do agree with you. Frontier is not it's very porous, and it's an infinity flujos, son flujos incesantes. Sí, es muy interesante. Gracias por tu respuesta.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I read your book. With pleasure.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Arturo, even your wider street shots have no people in them. Did you Photoshop them out, or did you just wait, or maybe it's just too quiet in Oxford to begin with?
No, that's a good question. So no, I always wait because I want the emphasis to be on the place. And so therefore I sometimes have to wait what feels like a ridiculous amount of time. Not because it's hours, sometimes it's like 15 minutes, but 15 minutes waiting for someone to, for the street to clear can feel like an eternity. And yeah, my intention is to for the focus to be on place. And I have nothing against street photography. I find it interesting. I used to do it myself, but depending on how you do it, if there's a person there, then that creates a kind of a narrative, and it's not uncommon for then the viewer to wonder who that person is, or come up with their own narrative about that person. Whereas if it's an empty street, then the focus is solely on the street.
Right, but you could also just Photoshop them out.
Yeah, but that, for me, that takes me further away from a more traditional documentary approach, which is what I'm trying to do. That's what I identify with. I try not to do a lot of editing, beyond the kind of editing that I would do in the darkroom, let's say, which is still a kind of an editing, but no compositing and on all of that stuff.
Right. And you mentioned that one of the two cameras that you used for this project was an analog camera, but you didn't mention anything about the second camera.
Oh yeah, they're both analog cameras. One is a 6x9 Fuji, and the other one is a Hasselblad, which shoots in a square format, and that's why those pictures are square.
So then, do you not actually shoot digital?
No, I scan all the negatives.
Also for the more recent projects that you've worked on, like the Borderlands one and the one in Mexico City.
Yeah, all of my projects are shot on film. I just enjoy that more. For me, the shooting is something that I enjoy very much. I say that because even yesterday, and this is kind of common in the photography world, there's a lot of photographers who don't enjoy photography. They're artists and they're legitimate artists, and I often like their work, but they make a point of saying how they don't enjoy photography. I enjoy photography very much, and so I enjoy shooting. So the act of making the pictures is very important to me, and for better or worse, I don't enjoy using digital cameras. I like not knowing. I like having a finite number of shots. I like the uncertainty. It also pushes me to be better technically, and so I don't shoot with digital cameras.
Interesting. Also interesting that you say that many photographers who don't like photography. I find that very intriguing. This book, this publication was a book. Did you also use or publish in other formats online? Did you have an exhibition? Maybe it was presented in a gallery, but in a projection, or just a book?
So I have a website, and I have an Instagram account where I share sometimes versions of the pictures that end up in books. So sometimes I will make a picture with the phone to share it on Instagram, and then I'll take the same picture with my camera, and that I find interesting because it's often a picture of the same place, but they're different.
Yeah.
So that's one part. These pictures were shown in an exhibition that I had in the Savannah College of Art and Design Museum of Art. So I had a small solo exhibition there in 2021, and but that's the only time that they've been shown. One thing that I found super disappointing is that there was zero interest by the Contemporary Art Museum in Oxford to show these. And I tried many times, but I still didn't, haven't been lucky to show them there. So my desire would be, so this happens to this kind of photography, unfortunately. In 30 years, 50 years, I don't know when, someone is going to find these more interesting from Oxford, I mean. And, hopefully then they'll show them there. And I just hope to be alive then to see that, because I feel like they would create an interesting dialogue with the people that live there currently.
Yeah, maybe. But I don't think they would not be found not interesting because of the quality of your work. I think this is more a function of how society is evolving around the appreciation of visual media, which is much less and less considered an art form, I think, by the general public. So I'm not sure, but it's a historical document, that is for sure, what you produced. So but how the future will judge you or me or us, I don't know. What's your next project?
Well, I'm working on putting together this book that I shot in Mexico City when I came back from Oxford. And usually putting these books together takes a long time. So I shot this project, which is called Today Something, right after I came back from Oxford. And then from 2020 till 2025 in different bits of time, mostly from 2020 till 2023. And so I'm putting a book together of those pictures, and I'm finishing the writing that goes alongside it. I am not making a lot of pictures at the moment. And then I'm also writing this book that I just mentioned on urban landscapes. That's where my energies are at the moment.
I can also talk for hours, or have questions for hours, but I'll leave it to one more. You, particularly at the start of presenting this particular work, referred to Brexit and to a lesser extent the pandemic, but specifically Brexit, of course, is something that was your first picture, in fact, where he talks about this, is something that's very political. Now you live in San Francisco, I think you said, right?
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. Sorry, I'm often mix them up. Now you live in LA. Now, if there's one country in the world that's going through interesting times for political reasons, it's the United States, and California is at the forefront of trying to push back against the abuse, against the state of abuse that is forefronted by Donald Trump. Are you interested in using your artistic capacity to address the political situation in the US also, because you're Mexican and
yes and no. Yes, in that I'm interested as a person in those topics. I'm very invested in them. But what I have always tried to stay away from is making work that is very illustrative. And so certain aspects of the urban landscape can point to sociopolitical problems, I hope, without being too, again, didactic or illustrative. And so I want to incorporate aspects of the urban landscape that speak of those topics without necessarily being super direct. And that's actually one of the things that I am grappling with right now, how to do it. And I don't have an answer, I'm afraid. but yes to this, in the sense of like incorporating this sociopolitical dimension to the images, even if it's tangential. Because I'm not a photojournalist, and I appreciate very much what photojournalists do, but I want to bring in this in a tangential way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Babak, and Arturo. Thanks, a very big thank you for the presentation, for coming along, keeping us thinking. I think people will be thinking about what you've said and what the work you've made and how you're planning what you're doing next, I think will be a good talking point in the future.